Chapter 7. So we just read how Charlotte kind of played a trick on Mr. Millshark. I bet that felt really good. He was not a nice person. He was not very nice to her. And she kind of got him back a little bit, yeah. Chapter 7. Two of Ebenezer's stable boys, James Birch and Frank Stephen, had left Rhode Island some years ago for California. Now they were back and excited as two puppy dogs about their adventures. They were full of stories about Argonauts, the gold diggers, and Charlotte couldn't get enough of their tales. The West was wild and untamed. Prospectors, those are gold hunters, flocked to pan gold up and down the lower Sierras, were becoming millionaires overnight, and Sacramento, everyone was talking about Sacramento, California, the most important river port in the West. It was a boom town, and for a businessman, it was as tempting as a candy store because of a man struck it rich. Because if a man struck it rich, he had to have some place to take his gold and some place to spend its worth. People got to get it from one place or another, said James, so we started a small stage line. But now we're joining with other lines to start the California Stage Company. And we need good drivers. We need men in the mother lode where all the gold is, where they're mining. And we're planning to expand routes up and down the Pacific coast. So you can have your pick. Won't you come, Charlie? The money was good, and there was plenty of work for men that would go. But what interested Charlotte most was the talk about land. If you're looking to own any, it's cheap and plentiful, said Frank. Charlotte couldn't help but get excited. Why is she excited about land? Do you remember her dream way back at the orphanage? She wanted to have her own ranch, right? James persisted. We've secured boat passage from Atlanta to Panama. You would travel overland by mule through Panama and then secure a ship to San Francisco, and then take a riverboat to Sacramento. It's a month's journey, but when you get there, there's land as far as the eye can see, just waiting to be bought by you, Charlie. Their enthusiasm was catching. Well, boys, that land sounds mighty appealing, said Charlotte. Come on, Charlie, you're the best driver we know, and we need you, said James. Charlotte knew from the minute they started talking about land that she would go, but she had to tell Ebenezer, and that wouldn't be easy. So Ebenezer kind of gave Charlotte her shot, right? Her chance. He taught her how to drive horses, and he kept her safe and away from Mr. Millshark. So I bet she feels kind of sad or scared to kind of leave Ebenezer. It ain't a pony ride out there, Charlotte. Ebenezer's practically shouted. Ebenezer practically shouted. In some places there ain't roads, just worn down trails made by pack mules that went afoot, that went afore you. Mrs. Eilers is having trouble reading today. The ground is filled with chunk holes, and you'll be knee-deep in dust. Yes, sir, but I need to go, said Charlotte. You don't know what you're in for. Most of the horses are just wild mustangs they bought from the foothills that don't know how to work in the traces. You'll only make 3 miles an hour on a good day. He paced back and forth. I hear the coaches are so loaded with folks heading for the mining towns, they have to put passengers on the roof. You'll lose 'em off the top. And you got other things to consider. California ain't no place for for you. So he does know. Ebenezer had never, not once, said anything about Charlotte's secret. He never confronted her. He never asked her outright, but he knew. He rubbed his hands over his bald head. Charlotte tried to explain. I aim to get me a ranch, and I won't ever be able to afford it here in the East, she said. Out West, there's land to be had. Cheap. I don't want to spend the rest of my life sleeping in a loft. I want to get me a place, my own place, a home. He stopped pacing, crossing his arms, and said, What about Indians? You thought about that? And carrying all that bullion, which is gold? Why, a robber will look at you and think you're plump ripe for picking. Charlotte didn't answer him. She knew she was going, and so did he. Ebenezer sat down. He looked defeated. You're my best driver. I know I never said anything, but, well, you remind me of somebody, and it's just done my heart real good to see you outdo all them other drivers. All them other boys. His voice drifted off. I had a child once, a girl. She died from the fever, same as my wife. But that little girl, she could ride like the wind. I ain't never seen anything like it, except you." He was quiet. Charlotte walked over and took his hand. "I guess I put more stock in having you around than I should," he said. "I just hate to lose you to California." Charlotte didn't want to lose Ebenezer either. He had been good to her. He had let her make her way her own way. He had protected her like a daughter. "I just bet when I get my place you could come out and start a livery," said Charlotte. "You heard them boys talking. Sounds pretty exciting, don't it?" His eyes perked up a little at the prospect. "And I'll need you out there," she said. "I aim to get a bit of land. Why, I can't run a big place by myself." "I guess I could think about it," said Ebenezer. "Down the line. Guess I'm not too old to travel. Maybe someday." They looked at each other. He half smiled. "Well, get going and pack your things. I told you a long time ago that working for me would be temporary. Don't you get harmed out there. And you need anything, you holler." By now Charlotte understood his blustery ways. "Thank you," she said. "What's your name, anyway?" he grumbled. She smiled and bent over and whispered it in his ear. So she's never told anyone her secret, and he knows. And she gets to tell him her real name. Charlotte stood on top deck of the Wilson G. Hunt, a palace of a steamboat, while it chugged up the Sacramento River. She had been traveling for 4 weeks and a day and was anxious to reach Sacramento. So to get from out east, Rhode Island, to Sacramento, California, a complete other side of the country, they had to travel for 4 weeks and a day. They had to go down the coast through South America, through Panama, and then all the way up the coast to California. It's a long way to travel. Now we can do it in a 5-hour plane ride. She felt like she did on that day on the stagecoach when she'd run away from the orphanage, like she was on the verge of something exciting, something new, like she was closer to realizing her dream. The delta sprawled in front of her. It was a damp green blanket met by gentle hills. Rivulets of water shimmered through the delta. Over the hills there was land that stretched out forever, speckled with a few trees and brush. It was just like Frank and James had said, plenty of wide open space just waiting for her. As soon as she had money, she was going to buy her own property, her own place. Then she would write Ebenezer and Hayward and ask them to come too. When the boat docked in Sacramento, the port was a mass of confusion. Stagecoaches crowded in the street next to the docks waiting for passengers. Armed marshals guarded strongboxes filled with gold dust, waiting for the outbound boats to San Francisco. Porters cursed and swore and tossed parcels on the docks, while dock handlers loaded the baggage onto the coaches. James said he'd meet the boat, but Charlotte didn't know how she'd ever find him. Charlotte shoved her way through the crowd. Horses whinnied and pranced impatiently. Passengers disembarked around her and crowded into the street like an army of ants at a picnic. I like that. Like an army of ants at a picnic. You can picture it in your head, right? Charlotte had never seen such confusion in her life. She was jostled one way and another. She kept looking for James. There were so many people. "Charlie! Charlie, over here!" Relieved, she spotted James trolling an extra horse. "James, I don't know who I'm gladder to see, you or that horse. Climb on, Charlie. Let's ride out of this mess." Charlotte hadn't been on a horse in some weeks, and it felt good to be riding again, and especially to be above the crowd. She moved the stallion slowly through the hustle of the docks and followed James towards the outskirts of town. But as quickly as they got away from the docks, they rode into another street crowded with laughing, jeering men. A woman stood on the steps of a saloon, passing out handbills to anyone who would take them. "Wyoming Territory is already talking about giving women the right to vote," she called. "If Wyoming can recognize a woman's rightful voice, then California should too." Then let the women move to Wyoming, yelled one of the men, and the crowd cheered. With the men out of the mines, many women are running the farms and should be able to make decisions that affect their properties and families. Women have already organized in the East, have already held a women's rights convention, she yelled back. Stick with cooking and babies, yelled another man, and the group let out a whoop of laughter. Most dropped the handbills on the ground and went inside. The others shook their head and walked away. The women folk hurried about their business, and many did not stop or look up, but Charlotte noticed a few picking up the handbills and tucking them into their pockets. Charlotte got off the horse and headed toward the saloon steps. Charlie, what are you up to? Hollered James. She approached the woman. I'd like one of them handbills, said Charlotte. The woman looked at Charlotte and handed over one of the papers. So this woman is talking about giving women the right to vote. Women did not have the right to vote. Only men did. Only men that owned land for a while, and then men. And so women have no vote. They have no voice. And how do you think Charlotte feels about that? No one knows she's a woman. Do you think she should stick to cooking and babies? I don't think that would do for Charlotte. Here's Charlotte getting one of the papers from the woman. Are you prepared to laugh also? She asked. No, ma'am, said Charlotte. I would be interested to know who you would vote for in the upcoming political race. The woman studied Charlotte's face for mockery. She's trying to see, are you trying to make fun of me? Charlotte said again, if you could vote, who would you vote for? While Charlotte listened, the woman explained her views on the candidates. She also told her about the convention in Seneca Falls, New York, and the women and men who gathered there in the name of women's rights. When she had finished, the woman said, You know there are men who support our movement too, young man. I agree with them men, said Charlotte, as she reached out and shook the woman's hand. Then Charlotte tipped her hat and said, You are much braver than me. She got back onto the horse and left the surprised woman standing on the saloon steps. Why do you think Charlotte said, You are much braver than me? I think Charlotte's pretty brave. She rides the horses. She's hiding. She escaped the orphanage. Why do you think she says the woman is braver than she is? Think about that. As she rode along, she read the handbill. She was familiar with politics. Stage drivers heard all the news from the passengers, and Charlotte had opinions of her own. She meant it when she told the women that she was brave. It took courage to stand up in front of all those laughing men. Charlotte wished she could have done something more for the lady. You sympathizing with her? Asked James. Sympathizing means feeling for her, agreeing with her. It's interesting, that's all, said Charlotte. You're going to find a lot of interesting things here, things you ain't never seen in the East. But right now, let's get you settled. A few miles out of Sacramento, James and Frank had converted a ramshackle building into a coach barn and stables. Outside, an impressive sign said, California Stage Company. Inside, Concord stages, the finest from the East, were lined up, waiting for the driver's next run. There was a bunkhouse for the hands, but since there was a loft, Charlotte found a storeroom off the tack room. Let's try that again. Since there wasn't a loft, Charlotte found a storeroom off the tack room, and it suited her fine. Everything's a bit makeshift, Charlie, said James. We aim to get things fixed up, but we got so much business we just ain't had the time. Everybody's in a hurry to get in and out of gold country, and time is money. How many drivers you got, and where are the horses? Asked Charlotte. We're starting with 10 stage whips at this stable, and already that ain't enough, but we're only taking good drivers, and the horses, well, that's another thing. We're making do with. I already bought a number of blooded stock horses from Australia and paid a small fortune for a particular strong stallion. I'm going to make this a reputable line with quality service, but horses haven't arrived yet. We rounded up some mustangs. They'll need to be shoed first thing in the morning. You ready to meet some Western horses? Tame or otherwise? Asked Charlotte. James laughed. Welcome to California, Charlie. Here everything's wild.